Governor, I want you to meet someone. Her name is Jennifer, Vice President J.D. Vance said, and the temperature in the room dropped even before anyone understood why. His tone wasn't loud, and it wasn't theatrical, but it carried that precise courtroom edge that makes people sit up straight. Governor Gavin Newsom held his smile for a beat, the kind of polished smile you can set a watch to, and then it flickered like a light bulb on a bad circuit. The cameras caught it, of course, because cameras always catch the moment a politician realizes the script is about to change. 40 million viewers didn't need a chyron to feel it, because the air on live television gets heavier right before something breaks. CNN had framed the night as a California crisis forum in Los Angeles, dated October 23, 2025, and the stage lighting was so harsh it made everyone look slightly guilty. The premise was simple. Homelessness up, crime anxiety up, residents and businesses leaving, and a governor expected to defend the state's direction without flinching. Newsom signed up to spar with critics and prove he could out-talk the narrative that California was spiraling. What he didn't plan on was sharing the spotlight with the Vice President of the United States, in person, in front of an audience primed for something more than a policy recital. When Vance flew in from Washington, it wasn't just to provide national perspective. It was to take a 2-hour conversation and aim it directly at Newsom's brand. They'd already been at it for a long time by the time Jennifer stood up, and the structure of the event was starting to look like a polite suggestion rather than a rule. Dana Bash, the moderator, had the expression of someone trying to keep a live broadcast inside the guardrails while the guardrails quietly rolled away. Newsom kept leaning on the familiar pillars: big economy, big values, big investments, and big problems that can't be fixed overnight. Vance kept answering with the opposite cadence: smaller sentences, sharper edges, less moral poetry, and more arithmetic. Then he paused, let the silence do its job, and directed the room's attention to a single person in the audience. The camera found Jennifer in row 7 on the left, and she didn't look like a political plant because she didn't look like anything TV normally bothers to glamorize. Early 50s, thinner than fashion. Not wellness thin, but thin the way a person gets when life doesn't pause for meals. Her clothes were clean but tired, like they'd been washed 1,000 times and still never quite forgiven for existing. The kind of face you see in real lines outside real offices. The face of someone who has spent too long hearing, "Come back tomorrow." When she rose, her hands trembled just enough to remind everyone that courage and fear can share the same body. "Governor Newsom," she began, and her voice shook, but the microphone caught every syllable like it was hungry. "You don't know me, but I know you," she said, and Newsom's expression slid into that practiced empathy pose, the head tilt, the soft eyes, the sympathetic mouth. He's done it for fires, for floods, for tragedies, for every camera-ready moment where compassion is part of the job description. "I'm sorry to hear about your situation," he offered, and it sounded like the first line of a speech he'd memorized years ago. Jennifer didn't react to it the way politicians expect people to react to it, which is to say, she didn't treat it like it mattered. "I used to live 3 blocks from your house in San Francisco, in Pacific Heights," she said, and suddenly the room stopped being abstract. She named the neighborhood, and you could feel half the audience mentally pulling up a map, the other half pulling up a memory of what Pacific Heights represents in the American imagination. Jennifer said she was a 5th-grade teacher at Monroe Elementary in the Sunset District, and that she taught for 17 years. She talked about loving the kids, the job, the routine, the meaning, the kind of middle-class stability people assume is permanent until it isn't. Then she described the slow unspooling, COVID, furlough, budget cuts, and a layoff that stopped being temporary and started being a new life. She said unemployment didn't cover rent, and she said it like someone who learned that fact in the worst possible way. By 2022, she said, she lost her apartment and ended up on the street, and the words landed with the bluntness of a hospital diagnosis. The hall went quiet enough that you could hear the HVAC system doing its indifferent work. Jennifer described the shelters as full, dangerous, or both, and she said she tried the hotlines, the applications, the processes that always sound humane in press releases. She said the waiting lists were 2 years, 3 years, and that keep checking back becomes a kind of cruel joke when you're sleeping outside. She described being attacked, robbed, and sick, and she didn't say it to make anyone feel sorry for her. She said it like it was a ledger. Then she delivered the line that turned the room from sympathetic to stunned. "You walked past me twice. Not your administration, not the system, not Sacramento, but you," spoken directly to the governor. She said she wasn't invisible and that he saw her and that they made eye contact. She described a doorway on Filbert Street in Pacific Heights, a November evening around 7, and Newsom coming out dressed for the kind of night people post about. She said he looked down for a second, stepped around her, kept moving, and the quiet afterward was the kind of quiet that makes you realize how rare it is to hear something unscripted on a political stage. Newsom opened his mouth, and nothing came out, because there are no clean talking points for that moment. Jennifer said the second time happened 2 weeks later, near Napa, and she named the French Laundry without needing to explain why that name matters. She described taking a bus because she heard there might be a shelter with openings, and she said there wasn't. She described sitting on the sidewalk about half a block away and seeing Newsom walk past with a group dressed for dinner, laughing like the world was stable. She said she slept outside that night while he went inside, and she told the audience she later looked up the cost, about $350 per person. She did the math out loud, roughly $3,000 for a group, and the math didn't have to be perfect, because the image was the point. The audience watched Newsom the way juries watch witnesses, trying to understand whether his face could find an escape hatch. At this point, Vance didn't rush, because the smartest move in television is often to let the other person's story hang in the air like smoke. He let the audience feel the emotional contrast between budget numbers and a specific human being, and then he added his own numbers anyway. He said Jennifer was one of roughly 181,000 homeless people in California, and he said that represented a massive share of the nation's homeless population concentrated in one state. He said Newsom had been governor for 7 years, and that California had spent $24 billion on homelessness programs. He paused long enough for the number to sound ridiculous, and then he said that works out to roughly $130,000 per homeless person. He didn't say anyone stole anything, but he asked the obvious question without asking it. Where did it go, and why didn't it reach someone like Jennifer? Vance looked at Newsom and framed Jennifer as a test of credibility, not a prop. And that distinction mattered because prop is the instinctive defense when a politician feels cornered. He called her a teacher who served California's children, paid taxes, did everything the social contract asks, and still ended up sleeping in a doorway. He said the government failed her, the programs failed her, and the spending failed her. And he emphasized failed the way prosecutors emphasize intent. He then pivoted from the spreadsheets to the personal. You saw her, he said, and you kept walking. And the room registered the difference between policy failure and moral distance. That's when Newsom's voice finally came back, and it didn't come back smooth. He tried to label the moment as ambush politics, as if calling it unfair could reverse the emotional arithmetic. He said vulnerable people shouldn't be used as political devices, and that's a line that usually plays well when the audience already trusts you. Vance cut in and said, essentially, that Jennifer had a right to be there, because she lived in the state and had spent years trying to use the systems Newsom praised. Newsom then made the kind of defensive statement that becomes a clip because it sounds technically reasonable and emotionally disastrous at the same time. He said he couldn't be expected to personally recognize and solve every individual situation, and the room reacted with gasps and groans. Jennifer didn't even look angry, which was worse, because disappointment reads like a verdict. From there, the night stopped being about who won a debate and started being about whether a public image can survive a specific story. Vance didn't pretend Newsom was a cartoon villain, and he didn't need to, because the point wasn't to accuse him of deliberate cruelty. The point was to underline the disconnect between grand narratives of compassion and the everyday visibility of suffering in places like San Francisco. Newsom tried to retreat into complexity, the safest word in modern governance, the word that means, don't judge me too harshly for not fixing it. Vance framed complexity as a cover for a system that spends a fortune and still produces doorways. And viewers at home were left with a question that doesn't require partisan loyalty to ask, if someone can spend $24 billion and still have Jennifer sleeping outside, what exactly is being purchased? To understand why the moment hit like a truck, you have to rewind to 2 hours earlier when the event still looked like a standard political cage match. In the green room, Newsom sat in a director's chair getting touched up under the kind of fluorescent reality that no elected official enjoys. His suit was the kind of navy that focus groups approve, tailored in a way that signals competence without screaming Hollywood. His hair was perfect in the way that makes people joke it has its own security detail. His communications director, Marcus Chen, paced with a tablet, reciting the narrative arc. California leads, California innovates, California cares, and yes, California struggles, but it tries. Newsom nodded like a man who had delivered variations of this message so often it might as well be muscle memory. Chen warned him Vance would go hard on homelessness, and Newsom gave the shrug of a politician who believes he can talk his way out of weather. He repeated the line about $24 billion as proof of commitment, because spending is always easier to measure than outcomes. He reminded himself to pivot toward values and the future, because the past is where the receipts live. He told Chen he'd done this 1,000 times, and that was probably true, at least in the sense that he'd faced plenty of critics. What he didn't know was that upstairs, in another green room, J.D. Vance was not prepping like a pundit. He was prepping like someone who thinks of politics as an argument you win by building a case file. Vance's table was covered in folders with color tabs, and the visual alone told you the strategy. Not feelings, not vibes, but documentation. His advisor, Sarah Martinez, ran a timeline on a whiteboard, splitting the 2 hours into segments like a trial. The first chunk, she said, was establishing failures with numbers and not letting Newsom float away into abstract language. The next chunk was business departures, then crime and quality of life, and then hypocrisy, the part that transforms policy critique into character critique without ever stating a crime. She listed topics like the French Laundry, private jet travel, school choice, and living in a bubble, and the words sounded like the outlines of a political autopsy. Then she got to the last piece, Jennifer, timed for when Newsom would already be tired and defensive. Martinez told Vance they'd checked Jennifer's story as best they could in a political context, meaning enough to feel confident without pretending the audience was a courtroom. She said Jennifer knew dates and places, and that details matter because details are what separate a story from a slogan. Vance flipped through a photo of Jennifer from the week before, sitting with a backpack on a sidewalk, and he didn't smile. He said Newsom expected the usual brawl where both sides declare victory afterward, and he said that wasn't the plan. The plan was to force Newsom to defend the indefensible, not by inventing something, but by stacking enough contradictions that the defense collapses under its own weight. He didn't say Newsom committed wrongdoing. He said, in effect, that Newsom's story about leadership couldn't survive contact with reality. When they walked on stage at 5:15 Pacific Time, Newsom waved like a man who believes he's in control of his own lighting. Vance nodded, like a man who believes the lighting is irrelevant. They shook hands for the cameras, and it looked normal enough, except the audience could already sense Vance wasn't there to trade slogans. Dana Bash explained the format with the calm professionalism of a moderator who still thinks the night will behave. Newsom gave an opening statement about California's economy, its innovation, its values, and he conceded the state wasn't perfect. He said $24 billion showed commitment to homelessness, and he framed the crisis as decades in the making. He called for compassion, evidence-based solutions, and a future worth building, and the applause was polite. Vance's opening was the opposite kind of speech. He praised optimism and immediately moved to reality. He cited population loss and argued people don't flee success stories at scale. They flee dysfunction. And he said California had experienced an exodus that can't be waved away as normal fluctuation. He referenced homelessness rising during Newsom's tenure and framed $24 billion as spending that demands measurable outcomes. He brought up private jets versus climate rhetoric, not as a legal accusation, but as a credibility test, because nothing destroys public trust faster than leaders asking for sacrifice while living in convenience. Then he said he wasn't there to tear down California. He was there to ask why a state with every advantage was producing so many visible failures. The room went quiet, because Vance wasn't playing for a cute moment. He was building a narrative that was hard to shrug off. The first major segment dove into homelessness and housing, and this is where debates often go to die, because they become a swamp of numbers and moral language. Newsom said the $24 billion was comprehensive, holistic, and aimed at services and supportive housing. Vance cut in with a basic question that sounds simple until you have to answer it precisely. How many units of housing did it produce? Newsom talked in thousands, and Vance demanded a number the way an auditor demands a number. When Newsom couldn't produce it on the spot, Vance produced one, claiming roughly 18,000 permanent supportive housing units, and the figure itself was less important than the arithmetic he attached to it. He said the cost per unit, by his math, was over $1 million. And even if the exact number is debated, the point was the same. How does it get that high in a country that can build housing cheaper elsewhere? Vance started describing layers of cost that have become familiar in California politics: land, permitting, environmental review, consultant fees, administrative overhead, and the slow churn of process. He cited media investigations and auditor reports as if he were reading from the record, which is a style that plays well with audiences tired of vague promises. He framed the spending as a system that employs armies of coordinators and administrators while leaving the visible crisis intact. Newsom tried to respond with complex factors and protections, and Vance treated those words like a confession that the machinery is too bloated to do its stated job. He didn't call it corruption, and he didn't need to. He cast it as a question of competence and incentives. And once the debate is about incentives, it's hard to win by saying you meant well. Then Vance pivoted to hypocrisy, not as a cheap insult, but as a pattern that makes voters feel manipulated. He brought up the French Laundry dinner during the pandemic, a story Newsom had addressed publicly years earlier, but Vance used it differently. Not as a gotcha, but as an emblem of rules for them and exceptions for us. He referenced the optics of indoor dining, while ordinary people were told to stay home and businesses were being squeezed. Newsom said he'd apologized, which is true in the broad sense that politicians apologize when the weather forces it. Vance implied the apology didn't erase the lesson voters absorbed, that leadership is often a performance, and the performance collapses when you see the backstage. He never had to say wrongdoing. He only had to say, what does that say about judgment? The conversation moved to climate rhetoric and private travel, and again, the point wasn't illegality, it was credibility. Vance cited travel records and the carbon footprint discrepancy between private and commercial flights. And he used that contrast to frame Newsom's messaging as lifestyle scolding from a position of luxury. Newsom tried to cite security and scheduling, which is what leaders always cite when they want audiences to accept exceptions. Vance argued the public hears security as special treatment, and once that translation happens, you can't easily translate it back. He asked why an official who demands dramatic changes from ordinary families chooses convenience so often for himself. He didn't say Newsom is a bad person. He suggested the public has reason to doubt the sincerity of sacrifice talk. That's an argument voters don't forget, because it touches daily resentment. Then came education. And this is where politicians often trip, because the personal example exposes policy abstraction. Newsom spoke in praise of public education, and Vance asked where his children went to school, knowing the question lands like a spotlight. Newsom tried to call it a private family matter, but once you're making statewide education decisions, privacy becomes a tough sell to parents whose kids are stuck in underperforming schools. When Newsom acknowledged private schooling, Vance framed it as the choice every parent would make if they could, and then asked why others are denied similar options. It wasn't a legal argument, it was a moral argument about access and hypocrisy. Newsom could have talked about balancing systems, but the reality is, on live TV, "My kids go private" always undercuts "trust the public system." The audience doesn't process nuance, it processes the contradiction. The business exodus segment followed, and Vance came armed with corporate departures and public statements, treating them like exhibits. He framed outmigration as an indictment of affordability, taxes, regulation, and quality of life, and he used the phrase hollowing out to describe the middle class. Newsom talked about normal population fluctuations and California's enduring appeal, and he leaned on the state's economic size like it was a shield. Vance kept returning to the same core point. Size doesn't equal health, and wealth doesn't equal stability for people living paycheck to paycheck. He described a state that works great if you're insulated and brutal if you're not. He didn't say Newsom caused everything. He said Newsom had been in power long enough that he can't be a spectator to the results. Crime and quality of life came next, and this topic is a minefield, because it's easy to inflate and easy to dismiss. Vance leaned on videos and anecdotes and the feeling people have when they walk into stores with locked shelves, while Newsom leaned on broader statistical framing and reform narratives. Vance claimed definitions and reporting patterns shape the numbers, and that the lived experience of residents often diverges from official narratives. He did not assert Newsom wanted crime. He suggested the policy choices have consequences that ordinary people feel even when the charts look reassuring. Newsom tried to push back on the idea of amplification, implying right-wing media exaggeration, and Vance treated that as denial of daily reality. The audience, by this point, had watched two different styles collide. Newsom speaking like a leader managing a story, and Vance speaking like a prosecutor managing a file. By the time Vance introduced Jennifer, Newsom had already been defending himself for 2 hours under a steady stream of contrasts: rhetoric versus outcomes, compassion versus distance, sacrifice versus convenience. That's why the Jennifer moment detonated the way it did, because it didn't arrive in a vacuum. It arrived after hours of numbers that implied massive spending with unclear results, and it converted those numbers into a face. It turned a political argument into a basic human question. Who is this system for, if not someone like her? Jennifer made it harder to hide behind abstractions, because she wasn't a chart. She was a person naming streets and seasons. And once the audience believed she might be telling the truth, the debate stopped being about ideology and started being about trust. Now, here's where I'm going to be careful and honest, because political storytelling loves certainty, and real life rarely offers it. I can't personally verify every detail of Jennifer's account the way a court would, and neither can most viewers watching from a couch. It's possible some parts are compressed by memory, or that timelines blur the way they do when someone has lived the same terrible day for years. It's also possible that every detail is exactly as described, and that the discomfort on Newsom's face came from recognition rather than surprise. Either way, the power of the moment didn't depend on perfect proof. It depended on plausibility and symbolism. And plausibility is often enough to break a political persona built on distance. Newsom tried to argue it was unfair to confront him with a single story, but that's the trap of leadership in a state with visible suffering. If you govern a place where homelessness is an everyday background image, you don't get to complain when the background steps forward. He said he couldn't solve every individual problem, which is a reasonable statement in the abstract, but on live television, abstraction is where empathy goes to die. People didn't hear, "I can't personally house everyone." They heard, "I can't be bothered." And that's a brutal misread in a moment built for emotional clarity. Vance didn't have to call Newsom heartless. He only had to let the audience interpret the governor's words through Jennifer's eyes. And once that interpretation forms, it's sticky. This is the part that political teams hate, because you can't fix it with a fact sheet. You can dispute the numbers, argue over program categories, explain that billions include healthcare and services and prevention and grants. You can cite housing constraints, blame local zoning, cite courts, cite federal failures, cite decades of neglect. You can do all of that, and none of it removes the picture of a teacher sleeping in a doorway near Pacific Heights. The human brain is not a spreadsheet, and the most powerful story always beats the most accurate footnote. That's not fair, but it's real, and anyone who has ever watched American politics should know it's real. When someone's personal story collides with someone else's luxury image, the collision becomes the headline. After the forum, the consequences in this kind of narrative are predictable, because modern politics runs on clips, not transcripts. People don't share 2 hours. They share 14 seconds. Usually the worst 14 seconds you gave them. The moment where Newsom said he couldn't be expected to solve individual cases is the kind of line that gets replayed, until it loses all context and gains all the meaning. Commentators will argue about whether that's fair, and fairness won't matter, because the clip will already be living its own life. Supporters will say it's a setup, critics will say it's the truth finally revealed, and undecided viewers will feel vaguely nauseated by the whole thing. That's how a political image shatters, not with a resignation, but with a sentence that doesn't land the way it was intended. If you want to understand why Vance's approach is so effective for this format, it's because he treats debates like a narrative trial. He doesn't need to prove a crime, and he doesn't need to prove intent, and he doesn't need to accuse anyone of anything explicit. He only needs to raise enough questions that the audience feels like the official story is incomplete. You spent $24 billion. Why does it look like this? Is not an allegation, it's a demand for coherence. You preach sacrifice. Why do you live this way? Is not a criminal charge. It's a credibility trap. Your kids go private. Why can't other families choose? Is not defamation. It's a political wedge. And Jennifer is right here, is not argument at all. It's theater that feels like truth. Newsom, by contrast, is a master of big framing. And big framing works when the audience is already inclined to trust you. He can speak in values and vision. He can tell a story about California as an idea. He can point to innovation and GDP and climate leadership. But big framing collapses when someone forces you into a narrow frame with a human face in it. Jennifer didn't ask for a 10-year plan. She asked why a system that claims compassion leaves her outside. She didn't ask for a task force. She asked why she keeps being told to check back. When a politician responds to that with complexity, it sounds like evasion, even when it's true. That's the brutal reality of governing visible crises. Explanations often sound like excuses. There's also a deeper cultural conflict simmering underneath this story, and it has nothing to do with party labels. People are tired of watching leaders speak in moral slogans while living in a world that looks nothing like theirs. They're tired of hearing, "We're doing everything we can," while the same problems remain visible year after year. They're tired of seeing the same neighborhoods get cleaner and richer while other neighborhoods become permanent emergency zones. They're tired of paying taxes and still feeling like basic order and basic dignity are slipping away. When Jennifer said she was a teacher for 17 years, she was invoking that old American bargain. Work hard, contribute, and the system won't let you fall through the cracks. Her story suggested the bargain failed, and that idea scares people more than any partisan argument. Now, it's worth noting, because nuance matters even when audiences hate it, that California's homelessness crisis is not created by one person. It's a mess of housing shortages, mental health policy, addiction treatment gaps, zoning battles, court rulings, local government fragmentation, economic shocks, and a state with extreme inequality. You can argue about which factor matters most, and people do, loudly, every day. But when you are the face of the state, you inherit the symbolism of the crisis, whether you deserve it or not. Newsom didn't choose every city policy in San Francisco, and he didn't personally write every local ordinance. Still, he chose to be the state's chief salesman, and salesmen get blamed when the product disappoints. That's what happens when you tie your identity to a place and that place becomes a national cautionary tale. That's why Jennifer mattered more than any chart, because she isn't just a contrast, she's a mirror. She forces viewers to imagine themselves one bad year away from a sidewalk, one layoff away from a tent, one illness away from a spiral. She also forces them to ask whether the leaders they've been told are compassionate can see them when the cameras aren't pointed. Newsom's defenders can say, reasonably, that governors can't personally interact with every struggling person. Vance's argument is that leaders can't ask for patience and trust while living in a different universe, because that's how patience turns into contempt. And Jennifer, by standing there, turned that abstract conflict into a moment you can't easily unsee. If you're Newsom, you want this to become a debate about using vulnerable people, because that's a safer moral ground than, why is she homeless? If you're Vance, you want the public to keep asking why, and to keep feeling that answers haven't arrived. That's the chess match. One side tries to shift the spotlight onto tactics. The other side tries to keep it on outcomes. The ugliness of this kind of political theater is that real people can get pulled into the machinery. Jennifer's pain becomes a symbol, and symbols get used by everyone, including those who claim they are above using them. That doesn't mean Jennifer is lying, and it doesn't mean she's a pawn. It means modern politics eats everything it touches, and the audience, knowingly or not, becomes the jury. If a small amount of additional texture makes the story feel more alive, it's this. You could almost see Newsom's staff calculating the damage in real time. Not because they're evil, but because that's their job, and because politics trains people to treat emotion like a measurable threat. You could imagine a producer whispering in Dana Bash's ear, asking whether they should cut to commercial. And you could imagine Dana choosing not to, because sometimes television senses history and decides to let it happen. You could picture Newsom's communications director staring at a phone, watching social media explode before the segment even ended. You could picture Vance's advisor quietly checking that Jennifer's microphone was still hot, because in that moment, the microphone was the story. None of that requires a conspiracy. It only requires competence, and competence is exactly what both sides brought to the room. And that's where the night's final irony lives. It wasn't a shouting match, it was a slow squeeze. Newsom didn't get destroyed by insults. He got squeezed by questions that forced him to choose between defensiveness and admission. Vance didn't need to accuse him of anything criminal. He only needed to portray him as out of touch and overconfident. Jennifer didn't need to call him evil. She only needed to describe being seen and stepped around. The audience didn't need to take a vote. They only needed to feel the discomfort. In modern political media, discomfort is often the strongest form of persuasion because it feels like discovery. People think, I just saw something real, and that feeling becomes the conclusion. So what's the takeaway if you're watching this as an American who has seen too many leaders promise and too few leaders deliver? 1. Massive spending without visible improvement breeds cynicism faster than any ideology war ever could. 2. Leaders who build their identity around compassion can't afford moments that look like indifference, even if the indifference is accidental or misunderstood. 3. The gap between elite life and ordinary life has become the central political issue, and it shows up everywhere, even in where someone eats dinner. 4. Audiences are less interested in policy complexity than in whether leaders seem to live in the same country. 5. Once a single story captures the public imagination, you don't get to argue it back into a spreadsheet. If Newsom wanted to survive that moment, he needed an answer that sounded human, not managerial. He needed to acknowledge the reality without hiding behind systems talk. And he needed to show that Jennifer's pain had actually entered his moral universe. Instead, he sounded like a man trying to escape responsibility for a thing that looks, to viewers, like the very essence of leadership. It's possible he didn't recognize her. Possible he didn't remember. Possible the encounters were as fleeting as a glance on a street. But politics doesn't grade on possibility. Politics grades on the story people believe. And Jennifer's story, whether perfectly accurate or broadly representative, provided the kind of narrative hook that sticks. It made viewers ask, if this is what he does when the cameras aren't there, what does he do when the cameras are there? Vance, for his part, didn't walk on stage to be liked. He walked on stage to be believed. His strategy relied on the audience being tired of smoothness and hungry for something that looks like accountability. He used numbers not to inform, but to frame. And he used Jennifer not to prove a legal case, but to prove a moral case. You can disagree with his politics and still recognize the mechanics. He built a narrative where the governor's words sounded like marketing, and the vice president's words sounded like prosecution. Newsom tried to stay above it, but above it reads like above you when someone like Jennifer is standing there. That's not ideology, it's the psychology of resentment. And resentment is the most powerful fuel in American politics right now. Now the story keeps moving, because political stories always do. And the next chapter would be the aftershocks. The clips would travel, the panel shows would posture, and the partisans would pick sides like they always do. Supporters would argue Jennifer was used, critics would argue Jennifer was ignored, and most ordinary viewers would simply feel sick about what the story represents. Newsom would point to real programs, real obstacles, real data, and he would say the problem is bigger than one moment. Vance would keep returning to the same frame. If the system is working, why does it look like this? Jennifer's name would become shorthand, a symbol, a debate weapon, and a reminder of the human cost that policy language often hides. And the country would keep arguing, not just about California, but about whether leadership in America still means anything beyond surviving the next clip. In the end, nobody needed to prove anything criminal for the moment to land. The power of the scene came from contradiction, from the way two realities sat side by side under CNN's lights and refused to blend. One reality was a governor who speaks fluently about values and investment, who knows how to look presidential, who knows how to occupy a room. The other reality was a former teacher describing pneumonia, doorways, and waiting lists that stretch longer than a human being can reasonably wait. When those realities collide, people don't ask for nuance. They demand a moral reckoning. And the worst part for any leader is that the reckoning doesn't come from opponents. It comes from the public's own eyes.